Lena had stopped believing in the word forever a long time ago. Foster homes were temporary. Friends came and went. Promises were empty. At 16, she had learned not to get attached, because attachment meant heartbreak. The social worker, Mr. Delroy, barely looked at her as he drove through the countryside. He had been through this routine countless times, picking up a kid, dropping them off somewhere new, pretending it wasn't just another house in a long list of places that wouldn't last. "This one's different," he muttered, mostly to himself. Lena didn't respond. She kept her gaze on the blurred scenery outside. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the fields. The air smelled like rain. Mr. Delroy cleared his throat. "Her name is Mrs. Evelyn. Lives alone. No other kids in the house. She's a bit old-fashioned, but she has a good record." Lena didn't care about records. She cared about how long it would take before this new place started to feel like a prison. The car slowed as they entered a narrow, winding road leading up to a house that seemed to stand apart from the world. It was old, too old, with ivy creeping up its stone walls, windows that seemed to watch her, and a front door that looked untouched for years. Lena tightened her grip on her backpack. "Here we are," Mr. Delroy said, forcing a smile. The door opened before he could knock. Mrs. Evelyn was tall, with silver-streaked hair and sharp blue eyes that seemed to pierce through Lena's soul. "Come in," she said. Her voice was neither warm nor cold. It was unreadable. Lena stepped inside, feeling the weight of the house settle around her. The wooden floors creaked under her feet. The walls were lined with old paintings, portraits of people whose eyes seemed to follow her. A shiver ran down her spine. Mr. Delroy exchanged a few words with Mrs. Evelyn, then turned to Lena. "You'll be okay here." Lena said nothing. She never said goodbye. The door closed behind him, and she was alone with the woman who was supposed to be her guardian. Mrs. Evelyn gestured toward the staircase. "Your room is upstairs, second door on the left." Lena hesitated before making her way up. The house smelled like dust and something faintly floral, like dried lavender. The bedroom was simple, plain bed, wooden dresser, a small window overlooking the garden. No personal touches. No signs that anyone had ever lived here before. She dropped her bag and sat on the bed. The mattress was stiff, unfamiliar. Loneliness settled in like an old friend. That night, she couldn't sleep. Something about the house felt wrong. The silence was too heavy, too unnatural. At some point, the sound of whispering woke her. She sat up, heart pounding. The voices were soft, distant, like echoes from another time. She told herself it was just the wind. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. She wasn't alone in this house. And she wasn't sure if that was a good thing. Lena spent the next few days trying to adjust to her new life, but something about Mrs. Evelyn's house felt wrong. It wasn't just the isolation, the eerie stillness, or the fact that Mrs. Evelyn barely spoke to her. It was something deeper. A feeling that she was being watched. A sense that the house held memories of people who had long disappeared. She told herself she was imagining it. But the whispers in the night were real. It started on the third night. Lena had trouble sleeping, the old house creaking as if it was shifting beneath its own weight. She tossed and turned, her mind playing tricks on her, until she heard it again. A faint whisper. Not the wind, not the old pipes, a voice. She sat up, holding her breath. It was coming from outside her door. Slowly, she slipped out of bed and tiptoed toward the hallway. The house was dimly lit, the shadows stretching long and distorted across the wooden floor. Then she saw it. At the end of the hallway, a door she had never noticed before. It was slightly ajar, as if someone had just slipped through. Lena's pulse quickened. She was certain that door hadn't been there before. She took a hesitant step forward, her bare feet cold against the floor. The air felt heavier the closer she got, as if she were stepping into a space that had been untouched for years. Pushing the door open, she was met with darkness. She fumbled for a light switch, but there was none. The air smelled musty, like old wood and forgotten memories. As her eyes adjusted, she realized she was standing in a long abandoned part of the house. The furniture was covered in dust-laden sheets, and the wallpaper was peeling in long, curling strips. But what caught her attention most was the row of small beds lined against the walls. Children's beds, each one neatly made, as if waiting for someone to return. A cold shiver ran down her spine. What was this place? Lena stepped further inside, her fingers trailing over the wooden frames of the beds. She tried to push down the growing unease in her chest. Then she saw it, an old leather-bound journal lying on one of the beds. Dust covered its surface, but when she picked it up, she felt an odd sense of connection, as if the book had been waiting for her. She opened it carefully, flipping past the first few brittle pages. The handwriting was delicate and slanted, as if written by someone young. March 12, 1964. I don't know if anyone will ever find this, but I have to write it down. I have to remember. I have to tell the truth. Lena's breath caught in her throat. She turned the page. We are the forgotten children. We lived here once, but we were never meant to leave. Her hands trembled. She kept reading. Mrs. Evelyn says she is kind, but kindness should not feel like a cage. We were never allowed past the gates. We were never allowed to ask questions. We were never allowed to remember what came before. Lena's heart pounded in her ears. This wasn't just a journal. This was a warning. The next morning, Lena sat outside on the front steps, staring at the journal in her lap. She had barely slept. The words from the book haunted her, whispering through her mind like echoes of something forgotten. She didn't notice Jonas, the boy from next door, until he spoke. You look like you saw a ghost. Lena jumped, nearly dropping the journal. Jonas was leaning against the fence, his dark eyes curious. She hesitated before closing the book. I didn't. His gaze flicked to the house behind her. People say that place is haunted, you know. Lena frowned. Do you believe them? Jonas shrugged. I believe houses remember things. Lena studied him. He was different from other kids she had met. Quiet, observant, as if he carried secrets of his own. You lived here long? She asked. Too long. A breeze rustled through the trees. Lena tightened her grip on the book. Jonas glanced at it. What's that? Nothing. His lips quirked into a smirk. If it was nothing, you wouldn't be holding on to it like it's a lifeline. Lena debated whether to tell him, but something about Jonas made her trust him, just a little. She flipped the journal open and let him read. His expression darkened as he skimmed the words. When he looked up, there was something unreadable in his eyes. You should leave it alone. Lena bristled. Why? Jonas hesitated. Because some things are meant to stay buried. She shook her head. I can't ignore it. Someone wrote this. Someone who lived here. Jonas exhaled slowly. I know. Lena's stomach dropped. What do you mean? He hesitated. I know because I've read about this before. A long time ago. This house wasn't just a house. It was a home for children. But something happened, and no one likes to talk about it. Lena stared at him. What happened? Jonas hesitated, his fingers tapping against the wooden fence. A girl went missing. Lena's heart skipped a beat. What girl? Jonas's voice was quiet. The girl who wrote that journal. That night, Lena couldn't stay away from the abandoned wing of the house. She needed answers. The journal mentioned a hidden place, a room where the forgotten ones left their final messages. She searched the walls, running her hands over the faded wallpaper, pressing against the wooden panels. Then, a click. A section of the wall shifted beneath her touch. Lena held her breath as she pushed, revealing a small hidden compartment. Inside, she found a bundle of old, crumbling papers. Letters. They were written in different handwritings, each one addressed to no one. I want to go home. Please don't forget me. She says we can never leave, but I don't want to stay forever. Lena's hand shook. These were the voices of children who had once lived here, and they had been trying to tell the world their story. A floorboard creaked behind her. She froze. Someone was standing in the doorway. Mrs. Evelyn. Her sharp blue eyes glowed in the dim light. "You shouldn't be in here, Lena." Lena swallowed hard, clutching the papers to her chest. Mrs. Evelyn stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "It's time for you to stop asking questions." Lena's pulse thundered in her ears. The air in the room felt suffocating, the weight of countless forgotten lives pressing down on her. And for the first time, she realized she might not be safe here. Lena felt frozen under Mrs. Evelyn's sharp gaze. The dim light cast shadows over the woman's face, making her look even more unreadable. "You shouldn't be in here," she repeated, her voice quiet, controlled. Lena swallowed hard, gripping the bundle of old letters against her chest. "They wrote these," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "The kids who lived here before. What happened to them?" Mrs. Evelyn didn't answer right away. Her gaze flickered to the journal in Lena's hand, then to the hidden compartment in the wall. "You don't need to concern yourself with the past." Lena's heart pounded. "The past concerns me if I'm living in it." A long silence stretched between them. Then Mrs. Evelyn sighed, stepping closer. She took the letters from Lena's hands, not roughly, but with a strange kind of sadness, as if she had been expecting this moment for a long time. "Curiosity can be dangerous," she murmured. Lena tensed. "That sounds like a threat." Mrs. Evelyn's lips twitched, almost like a smile, but there was no warmth in it. "It's a warning." She turned and walked away, leaving Lena alone in the dust-filled room. Lena didn't know whether to feel relieved or more terrified. That night, Lena lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Mrs. Evelyn had taken the letters, but she hadn't taken the journal. That meant Lena still had a piece of the past in her hands. The words of the missing girl, Saren, haunted her. "We lived here once, but we were never meant to leave." What did that mean? She had to talk to Jonas. She slipped out of bed, careful not to make a sound. The house was eerily quiet, except for the occasional creak of the old wood settling. The moon cast pale light through the hallway windows as she tiptoed down the stairs and out the front door. The night air was crisp, the scent of damp earth and rain lingering. Jonas's house was just next door. She had only known him a few days, but somehow she knew he would listen. She reached his window and tapped lightly. For a moment, nothing. Then the curtain shifted, and Jonas's face appeared. He squinted at her, then sighed and pushed the window open. "Lena?" His voice was groggy. "What are you doing?" She held up the journal. "We need to talk." Jonas studied her for a second, then nodded. "Give me a minute." A few moments later, he slipped out the back door and joined her beneath the oak tree in his yard. "What's going on?" he asked, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. Lena took a deep breath. "I found a journal. It belonged to a girl who lived in my house a long time ago. And I think she disappeared." Jonas stiffened. Lena flipped through the pages. She wrote about the house, about Mrs. Evelyn, about how she and the other kids were never allowed to leave. Then one day, the entries just stopped. Jonas didn't say anything. Lena frowned. "You already knew, didn't you?" Jonas ran a hand through his dark hair. "I knew there were rumors." "What kind of rumors?" He hesitated. "That Mrs. Evelyn used to run a children's home. But one day, it shut down without explanation. Some say she sent the kids away. Others," his voice trailed off. Lena's stomach tightened. "Others what?" Jonas's jaw clenched. "Others say the kids never left." A chill ran down her spine. "But that's just a story," Jonas added quickly. "No one ever proved anything." Lena looked at the journal. "Then we'll have to prove it ourselves." Jonas sighed. "I knew you were going to say that." The next morning, they met behind Mrs. Evelyn's house, near the old garden that hadn't been tended in years. Jonas held out a worn notebook. I did some digging last night. Lena took it, flipping through the pages. It was filled with notes, old newspaper clippings, and rough sketches of the house's layout. You wrote all this? Jonas shrugged. I like research. Lena glanced at a newspaper article taped to one of the pages. Local children's home closes unexpectedly. Residents move to undisclosed locations, says Director Evelyn Whitmore. No further details provided. There was no mention of where the children had gone. No list of names. No follow-up articles. It was like they had been erased. Lena's pulse quickened. What if they never left? Jonas exhaled. Then we need to find proof. That night, they waited until Mrs. Evelyn was asleep. Lena met Jonas at the back door, a flashlight tucked in her pocket. You're sure about this? Jonas whispered. Lena nodded. They slipped inside, the air thick with silence. They moved carefully, past the creaky stairs, through the abandoned hallway where Lena had found the journal. She pressed her hand against the same section of wall where she had found the hidden compartment. Jonas helped push, and this time, the wall gave way completely. Behind it was a narrow passage, a dark, descending tunnel. Lena swallowed hard. This wasn't in your research, was it? Jonas shook his head. Not even a little. They exchanged a look. Then, without another word, they stepped inside. The air grew colder as they walked, their footsteps echoing. The walls were damp, lined with bricks that looked ancient. Then they reached the end. A heavy wooden door stood before them, rusted with age. Jonas hesitated. You ready? Lena nodded. He pushed it open. Inside was a room. Small, stone-walled, untouched by time. And in the center, covered in dust, were tiny belongings. A stuffed bear, a wooden train, a pair of children's shoes. Lena's heart clenched. Then she saw it. Carved into the stone wall, over and over, were names. Saren, Thomas, Lily, Robin, Maria, the lost children. Lena reached out, tracing the names with her fingers. Then she saw the last one. One that hadn't been mentioned in the journal. Evelyn. Her breath caught. Jonas whispered, That's Mrs. Evelyn's name. Lena's mind raced. Had she been one of them? Before she could say anything, a voice echoed behind them. You shouldn't be here. Lena and Jonas spun around. Mrs. Evelyn stood in the doorway, her face unreadable. Her blue eyes flickered with something between sorrow and anger. Lena's heart pounded. This time, she wasn't going to let the past stay buried. The air in the hidden room felt heavier now. Lena and Jonas stood frozen as Mrs. Evelyn blocked the doorway, her blue eyes unreadable. You shouldn't be here, she repeated, her voice quiet but firm. Lena tightened her fists. You lied to me. Mrs. Evelyn's expression didn't change. Jonas took a cautious step forward. What is this place? For a long moment, Mrs. Evelyn didn't answer. Her gaze drifted past them, to the names carved into the stone walls. Then she sighed. This used to be a sanctuary, she murmured. A place for those who had nowhere else to go. Lena's chest tightened. The children. Mrs. Evelyn nodded. I tried to give them a home. Jonas narrowed his eyes. Then why did they disappear? Mrs. Evelyn's fingers brushed over the carved names. Her shoulders sagged, as if she were carrying the weight of all the years that had passed. They didn't disappear. Lena swallowed. Then where did they go? Mrs. Evelyn looked at her, and in that moment, Lena saw something she had never expected. Grief. Deep, aching grief. They died. The words hit Lena like a punch to the stomach. Jonas sucked in a breath. What? Mrs. Evelyn closed her eyes, as if the memory itself was too painful to face. There was a sickness, she said finally, a fever that spread through the house like wildfire. It took them one by one. I tried to save them, but... She stopped, her voice breaking for the first time. Lena felt her own breath hitch. This wasn't the answer she had been expecting. Jonas crossed his arms. Why didn't you tell anyone? Why didn't you call for help? Mrs. Evelyn opened her eyes, and for the first time, there was something raw in her gaze. No one cared about them, she said bitterly. No one even knew they were here. Lena's stomach twisted. The letters, the journal entries, she had thought they were proof of something sinister, but they were really the voices of children who had been forgotten by the world long before they ever died. Lena's throat felt tight. What about Saren? Mrs. Evelyn flinched. Jonas glanced at Lena. Who's Saren? The girl who wrote the journal, Lena whispered. The last entry was unfinished. She never wrote about what happened to her. Mrs. Evelyn's fingers curled into fists. Saren was the last. Lena's pulse quickened. What do you mean? Mrs. Evelyn exhaled shakily. She held on longer than the others. But when the fever finally took her, she shook her head. I couldn't bear to let her go. Lena's breath caught. You buried them here, didn't you? Jonas asked quietly. Mrs. Evelyn hesitated, then nodded. Lena pressed a hand to her chest. The children weren't just names carved into the walls. They were still here. Lena and Jonas followed Mrs. Evelyn as she led them deeper into the tunnels. She stopped in front of another door, this one smaller and older than the last. With shaking hands, she pulled it open. Inside was a space no bigger than a closet. And in the dim light, Lena saw them. Small wooden markers lying neatly against the stone floor. Each one had a name. Lena felt her knees go weak. Saren, Thomas, Lily, Robin, Maria. They had never left. Mrs. Evelyn's voice was barely a whisper. I couldn't let them be forgotten. Jonas swallowed hard. So you just kept living here, alone. Mrs. Evelyn nodded. Someone had to remember them. Lena blinked back tears. For years, people had spread rumors about the house about Mrs. Evelyn, but no one had ever known the truth. She wasn't a monster. She was a woman who had lost everything. Jonas looked away, his jaw tight. You should have told someone. Mrs. Evelyn let out a hollow laugh. And what would they have done? Arrested me, called me a murderer. She shook her head. No one wanted them when they were alive. No one would have cared when they were gone. Lena bit her lip. I care. Mrs. Evelyn's eyes flickered to her. Lena stepped forward, looking at the small graves. They deserved to be remembered. Mrs. Evelyn's expression softened. I wanted to give you a home, she admitted. I thought maybe if I took you in, I could make up for what I lost. Lena's heart ached. She had spent her whole life without a family. She had been passed around, unwanted, unseen. But here, in this forgotten house, surrounded by the names of children no one else had remembered, she realized something. She wasn't alone, and neither was Mrs. Evelyn. The next few days passed in a blur. Jonas helped Lena clean the hidden room, placing fresh flowers near the wooden markers. They didn't speak much, but there was an understanding between them now. Mrs. Evelyn didn't stop them. She watched from a distance, her face unreadable. Then, one morning, Lena found her sitting on the porch, staring out at the trees. Lena hesitated before sitting beside her. Mrs. Evelyn sighed. You must think I'm a terrible person. Lena shook her head. I think you're a sad person. Mrs. Evelyn smiled faintly. That might be worse. Lena looked down at her hands. I never really had a family, she admitted. Not one that stayed anyway. Mrs. Evelyn glanced at her. Lena took a breath. But maybe it doesn't have to be like that anymore. Mrs. Evelyn's expression softened. And for the first time since Lena had arrived, the house didn't feel haunted anymore. It felt like a home. The house was different now. The air no longer felt thick with unspoken secrets, and the creaking of the old wooden floors didn't sound so eerie anymore. The weight of the past hadn't vanished, but it no longer loomed like a shadow over Lena's every step. Still, the truth remained. This place had been a graveyard of forgotten children, and Lena couldn't let them be forgotten any longer. The morning was cold. the sky painted in shades of gray as Lena and Jonas stood in the backyard with Mrs. Evelyn. A soft breeze rustled the trees, carrying the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. Before them, a row of small wooden crosses stood in the soil, marking the resting places of the children who had once called this house home. Lena tightened her grip on the bundle of flowers in her arms. "They deserve more than this," she said quietly. Mrs. Evelyn nodded, her expression unreadable. "I know." It had taken days of convincing, but Mrs. Evelyn had finally agreed to hold a memorial, a proper farewell for the children who had been buried in the tunnels beneath the house. Jonas stepped forward, placing a candle beside one of the markers. "It feels strange," he admitted, "saying goodbye to people we never knew." Lena swallowed hard. But they knew this place. They lived here. They mattered. Jonas nodded, but his gaze lingered on the small crosses. "Do you think they ever felt happy here?" Mrs. Evelyn exhaled, her voice quiet. "I hope so." Lena knelt, arranging the flowers in front of each marker. They shouldn't have had to hope for happiness. They should have had a real home. Mrs. Evelyn turned away, her fingers trembling. Lena hesitated before speaking again. "I don't think you're a bad person," she said softly. "But I think you let your grief trap you." Mrs. Evelyn flinched, but she didn't argue. Jonas ran a hand through his hair. "You can't keep living like this, keeping everything locked away." Mrs. Evelyn was silent for a long time. Then, finally, she looked at them. "What do you suggest I do?" Lena took a deep breath. "Let people in." Mrs. Evelyn blinked, as if the idea had never occurred to her. "Let this place be more than a tomb," Lena continued. "It was once a home. It can be one again." Jonas nodded. "You could turn it into something new. A place where kids like Lena, kids who don't have anywhere to go, can find a family." Lena's heart pounded at her own words. A part of her had expected Mrs. Evelyn to dismiss the idea. But instead, she looked thoughtful. After a long moment, she said, "That would take time." Lena felt hope bloom in her chest. "Then let's start now." The next few weeks were unlike anything Lena had ever experienced. She had never stayed in one place long enough to settle, never had a reason to believe that a house could ever feel like a home. But now, something was changing. Mrs. Evelyn didn't suddenly become warm and affectionate overnight, but she started opening up, little by little. She let Lena help clean out the old rooms, ones that had been left untouched for years. Jonas came by every day, helping fix broken windows and peeling wallpaper. They repainted the walls. They repaired the front porch. And slowly, the house that had once been a place of sorrow started to feel alive again. One afternoon, Lena stood in what used to be the children's playroom, watching sunlight filter through the newly cleaned windows. Mrs. Evelyn stepped in behind her. "I sent a letter," she said. Lena turned, raising an eyebrow. "To who?" Mrs. Evelyn hesitated before answering. "The local shelter. There are children there who need a home. I thought." She trailed off, then took a breath. "I thought maybe we could offer them one." Lena's throat tightened. "You mean?" Mrs. Evelyn gave a small nod. "Yes." A slow, hopeful smile spread across Lena's face. It wasn't just about honoring the past anymore. It was about building a future. The first child arrived 3 weeks later. Her name was Nia. She was 6 years old, small and quiet, with wary eyes that reminded Lena too much of herself. She barely spoke when she first arrived, clinging to the stuffed rabbit she carried everywhere. Mrs. Evelyn knelt beside her, speaking softly. "This is your home now." Lena watched as something flickered in Nia's expression. Hope, uncertainty, fear. It was the same way Lena had felt when she first stepped into this house. Later that night, as Nia sat curled on the couch, Lena hesitated before sitting beside her. "Hey," she said, "do you want to hear a story?" Nia didn't answer, but she didn't move away either. Lena took that as a yes. So she opened Saren's journal, the one she had kept all this time. and began reading. She read about the children who had once lived here, about their laughter, their adventures, their dreams. She read about Saren, and for the first time, she didn't feel haunted by the past. She felt connected to it, because this house wasn't just a place of loss anymore. It was a place of second chances, a place where forgotten children could finally belong. Lena glanced at Mrs. Evelyn, who sat nearby with a distant look in her eyes. Maybe, just maybe, they had all found the family they had been searching for. And this time, they were here to stay. The end.